the 8th day. In the beginning, God felt something on his tongue. He tasted it, and at last he spit out light. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. God made water because the sky seemed gratuitous, and this was the second day because God could think of nothing else to make. On the third day, the vegetation tore itself green and lush and puddled in. The air felt lonely, so God invented birds. He forgot to make them silent, and their shrieking unnerved him. Resignedly, he sank half and made fish. There were angelfish, God found this clever, and regal tangs. The starfish were so beautiful, they made God blush. There was one frail birdfish left over. It broke open and flew into God's mouth. Out came the 5th day. The goats were very lovely to God, so he formed many and grouped them in herds. God liked this idea of togetherness. He scattered the landscape. Sometimes he paused and behind left a valley. Man startled God the first time they met. God hid in a cloudburst and took deep breaths. Adam was not afraid because he did not know what trouble was. Eve stood before Adam. She had the privacy of trees and was webbed in secrets. They sat beside each other without touching and looked at the same cloud. All the other animals left them because this was a very human kind of existing, and then they slept. The first word Adam said was oopsie, which means... The word sounded very much like a fallen log, hollow in the middle but slippery on the surface. God laughed, thinking perhaps Adam was making a joke, and the frogs hurled themselves up on the shore. Eve thought God was very awkward. She made him sit beside her and practice words. She taught him to skip and then to swim. God looked like a polite octopus in the water. He decided to make an ocean so he could swim on his back and look at his sky. The first time Adam belched, it was a poem. God made fire, and that night they told stories. Eve taught God to dance, and they forgot to sleep. This was the 7th day, and there was one day after it, but it was never mentioned because that day was cursed. 2. This was the first sin. It was a guava, and when she broke the skin, the flesh was pickled pink and raised. It was bright and secretive, and she had seen it first. Eve bit, and longing filled her body. She saw herself on a long train coasting into the middle of the earth. She saw herself rushing on a street, a small child caught in her arms, his breath hot in her ear. She did not see Adam. Eve went to find her husband. When she reached him, he was in a flower bed, looking like a gazelle. He had been thinking about Eve's hands. She kissed him and put a guava piece in his mouth. Her kiss blistered his lips because the love was selfish. They lay down, and the grass pricked the backs of their neck, and the moon that night was an aching white eye. 3. Eden. He said, "If you leave me, I'll go hungry." Above them, the moon turned pale as mustard and held its breath. She said, "Come with me. It will be easy in the dark." He said, "It isn't the right time." She said, "I'm 100 years old and I'm tired." The grass began to slither. He said, "The crops will fail, the animals will run wild." She flexed the sentence like a muscle. "My body will be our harvest." The tree panted and sighed. He said, "I'm afraid." She made a web of her hands and caught his face. He said, "I'm afraid." She said, "I'll go first." 4. This is the last poem in this Genesis series. When God gave Eve a baby boy, she wept with such earnestness the sun hid behind the moon. Cain grew up slowly, probing the earth for pockets of dirt. He had a pale voice and a talent for violence. Cain killed his brother Abel in the summer with the dew still heavy in the grass. God found the boy lifeless in the field and stood and stared until evening. He realized Abel was dead, not merely sleeping when he could not find Abel's dream. When Eve heard the news, she refused to cry. She pictured herself in a jet plane streaming across heaven in perfect silence. A million years later, I was in the airport staring at the little birds pressed against glass, the ones modeled by the windows, dumb things seeking light in lieu of sky. A woman in a dark suit was coming towards me. And I was really interested in hearing the other poets who read tonight, sort of their experience of living in the borderlands or on the border in those spaces that we feel like those cultures that don't seem to belong to sort of either or. And I spent my childhood overseas, and the last place I lived was Africa. And when I came back, I had this overwhelming sense of loss, and that's sort of what prompted this poem, sort of the idea that loss becomes a country all in itself. And that sort of longing when you were in an in-between space of not really knowing where your identity is. So that's where this poem comes from. It's called What Makes Us Ghosts. An epitaph, a testimony, a ticket. I once sat there and moved here, but there was more space somehow. There was excess and room to creep. The Hopi Indians believe events recur on certain ground. I lift up the map, time signals through spaces, the question of return. Africa, she says, gets in the blood, but it isn't in my veins. Malaria is a hot stretch of sunbake, dozing at midday, nameless birds at the cusp of evening, shadowing off into trees, silhouettes of unbearable crimson. This is what I want in my blood. Sounds of frogs opening their throat, the dirt of the place smacked hard into the ground until the earth bleeds copper. I want it crammed beneath my nails. I want it safe in my mouth. The gulf between two unreachable places is a famine nation. The first time I slipped on ice, I cracked my head and dreamed hot red earth for days. Longing possesses a strange geography. Hiking last week in High Banks, he stopped me at Indian burial site, sacred ground, he says, pointing to a little mound and crystallized quiet. We had 2 African lovebirds our first year, molten red and green babies like Christmas candy. They roped together for 3 days before one died. The other, suddenly cold, died a day later. We buried them and you read a violent psalm by accident. Bearing witness to a place when the other half has broken away, risks ferocity, inevitably something assassinates. Loss is a country all in itself. I met a woman one evening, later a friend who had lived in Japan through childhood. When she returned to Karazawa as an adult, she said she had to kneel down to recognize the place. A girl watches me through the heat, a baby on her back. She regards me as a child, though I am older. Cold stone floors hold moon breath through the swelter hours. Dry season, and my hands are at the mango tree again, the red fruit sweating like lungs in my palm. After the earth spun beneath me, I thought if I could throw myself off balance, I might wind up in Argentina or Moscow, or if I was lucky, back amidst the red Saharan heat. I shuddered in my creature madness, broken open in the mornings and waiting for the bus, faltering quick steps into the ground, recur, recur.